He didn't even have the decency to look her in the eye. Nathan slid the divorce papers across the kitchen table like he was passing her a grocery receipt, casual, almost bored, while the candles she had spent 2 hours lighting flickered between them. "I need more than this, Evelyn. More than you." He straightened his tie, checked his phone, and walked back out the front door without touching a single bite of the dinner she had cooked. He never looked back. And that was the last mistake Nathan Reed would ever make. If this story already has you feeling something, drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about this woman. The town of Beaufort, South Carolina had a way of making people feel like time moved slower there. The salt air came off the water in the early mornings, thick and warm, and it settled over everything. The Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks, the old painted porches along Carteret Street, the fishing boats rocking quietly at the marina. People there weren't in a hurry. That was the whole point of living in a place like that. You stayed because you wanted a life that didn't demand too much from you. Evelyn Carter understood that feeling better than anyone. She had chosen Beaufort deliberately, the way someone chooses a hiding place. Not out of fear exactly, but out of exhaustion. She had been 24 years old when she first drove into town with nothing but 2 suitcases, a fake last name, and the desperate need to disappear from a world that had never once asked her what she actually wanted from it. That was 11 years ago. Now she was 35, and for the past 7 of those years she had been Evelyn Carter, wife, volunteer librarian assistant, decent cook, unremarkable woman in a quiet coastal town. She drove a second-hand Honda. She clipped coupons on Sunday mornings. She wore her dark hair in a braid when she gardened, which she did badly and enthusiastically, and without any of the grace people assumed she possessed because she was tall and angular and carried herself like someone who had never once tripped on a curb. She had tripped on that same curb on Craven Street no fewer than 14 times. The neighbors liked her. The librarians liked her. Mrs. Patricia Gaines next door left tomatoes on her porch every August, and Evelyn always left a jar of jam in return, even though her jam was genuinely terrible, too sweet, with chunks that hadn't broken down properly, and Mrs. Gaines was too polite to ever say so. It was a small life, a gentle life. Evelyn had loved it more than she could explain. She met Nathan Reed at a hardware store. That detail always made people smile when she told it later, in the early days of their marriage when the story still felt romantic. He had been reaching for the same can of exterior paint, a particular shade of slate gray, and they'd both grabbed it at the same time and looked at each other and laughed. He was handsome in a straightforward way, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes and an easy grin that made him look like he was in on a joke you hadn't heard yet. He was 30 at the time, a project manager for a small construction firm, practical and steady and seemingly content with ordinary things. "You planning to paint a barn with this much?" he'd asked, looking at the 3 cans she'd been hauling. "I'm painting a porch," she'd said. "I bought extra because I always mess up the first coat." He had laughed at that. Not a polite laugh, a real one. And she had felt something loosen in her chest. They dated for 8 months. He never pressed her about her past. She told him her parents were gone, that she'd grown up with an aunt in Virginia, that she'd moved around before landing in Beaufort. All of it was technically true, if incomplete, in the way that a photograph of a room can be true without showing you what's behind the door. She didn't tell him about Blackwood. She didn't tell anyone about Blackwood. The name Evelyn Blackwood meant something in certain circles. In boardrooms in New York and London and Singapore, in private equity firms and family office networks, in the kind of rarefied world where people talked about fortunes not in millions but in generational wealth that had compounded for 60 years. The name Blackwood carried weight. Her grandfather, Harold Blackwood, had built the original company from a regional shipping operation in the 1960s into a diversified holding company that eventually touched commercial real estate, energy infrastructure, pharmaceutical distribution, and technology investment. By the time he died, Blackwood Global had assets under management that most small countries would envy. Her father, Charles Blackwood, had been a colder man than his father. Sharper, more political, more comfortable with ruthlessness as a business strategy. He had expanded Blackwood's reach and its enemies in roughly equal measure. He had also, in his own limited way, loved his daughter. When Charles died of a sudden cardiac event on a Tuesday morning in October, Evelyn was 23 years old and stood to inherit controlling shares in a company she had spent her entire life being groomed to lead and desperately not wanting to. She had watched what the Blackwood world did to people. She had watched it do it to her father. She had watched it do it to her mother, who had grown hollowed out and medicated and finally quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. And so Evelyn had done the thing that no one in her family's world believed was possible. She had walked away. Not impulsively. She was too careful for that. She had worked with the company's most trusted legal counsel to structure her inheritance into a holding trust that continued to generate returns and preserve her ownership stake while she remained legally absent from active management. She had signed every paper. She had read every clause. And then she had gotten in a car and driven south until the skyline of the city was gone and the air smelled like salt water. She was not running away. She was choosing herself. That was what she told herself anyway. For the first 3 years of their marriage, things between Evelyn and Nathan were, if not perfect, genuinely good. He was affectionate and present in the ways that mattered to her. He noticed when she was anxious before she said anything. He brought her coffee without asking, black with 1 sugar, the way she liked it. And he remembered that she hated surprises but loved spontaneity, which he somehow understood was a different thing. He had a dry humor that caught her off guard, and she found that she could talk to him, really talk, in a way she hadn't been able to talk to most people in her life. They argued the way real couples argued, about money sometimes, about small things that weren't really about the small things, about her not wanting to go to his colleagues' parties and him feeling embarrassed explaining her absence, about the way she sometimes went quiet for days in a manner he found impossible to read. She loved him. She loved him imperfectly, with the kind of love that carries some fear in it, the fear that he would eventually find her too strange, too contained, too much and not enough at the same time, the fear that if he ever found out who she actually was, it would change everything. The change in Nathan didn't happen all at once. That would have been easier to identify and easier to fight. It crept in. It started, she would realize later, the year Nathan got passed over for a senior management position at a competing firm. He had applied quietly, not telling her until after, and when he didn't get the role, he came home with a quietness that was different from the usual kind. Harder, more brittle. They gave it to someone who went to Princeton, he told her. That's all it was. That's all it ever is. She tried to say the right thing. She was fairly certain she hadn't. After that, she noticed him watching things differently. The houses in the wealthier part of town. The men who came into Beaufort on boats from somewhere else, wearing watches that cost more than their car. He started reading business books and financial podcasts and following people on social media she didn't know the names of. None of that was wrong in itself. But there was a hunger behind it that hadn't been there before. A restlessness that slowly crowded out the easy, unhurried man she had fallen in love with in a hardware store. He started talking about New York, about opportunities, about how staying in Beaufort was fine for some people, but not for a man with real ambition. "You've never been ambitious?" he told her once, and she could tell he meant it as an observation, but it landed differently. She hadn't said, "I've been to 4 continents on private aircraft, and I turned down $1 billion inheritance to live here with you." She had said, "Maybe not the way you mean it." Beck. Victoria Holloway entered the picture through a business development conference Nathan attended in Charlotte. He came back different. Evelyn didn't know the name then. She only knew that something had shifted in the weeks that followed. A new distance, a new distraction, a way of looking at his phone and then putting it face down that she recognized with a low dread she tried to argue herself out of. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself she trusted him. She told herself a lot of things in those months that she later understood were just the mind's way of protecting itself from something it isn't ready to survive yet. Their 7th anniversary fell on a Thursday in late April. Evelyn had spent the day cooking, not out of some compulsion to perform domesticity, but because cooking was one of the things she genuinely loved, one of the ordinary pleasures she had discovered in her ordinary life. She made the roast chicken with lemon and herbs that they'd eaten on their first real date at the little restaurant on Port Republic Road, the place that had since closed. She opened a bottle of the Malbec he liked. She lit the candles, real ones, the tall tapered kind, not the jarred kind she usually kept for ambiance. She was wearing a blue dress. She had thought about what to wear. That detail would humiliate her later. The fact that she had stood in front of her closet for 10 minutes, deciding what to wear to the dinner at which her husband would serve her divorce papers. Nathan came through the front door at 6:47 p.m. He was still in his work clothes. He set his keys down. He looked at the table, the candles, the good plates, the wine, and his jaw tightened in a way she couldn't fully read. Then he reached into his jacket and set a manila envelope on the table. "I need you to look at those," he said. She didn't pick it up. She looked at him. "Nathan." "I've had them drawn up for a few weeks," he said. His voice was flat. Rehearsed, she thought, like he had practiced this in the car. "I think it's better this way for both of us." "Better," she repeated. "We both know this isn't going anywhere, Evelyn." She felt something go very still inside her. Not the dramatic crumbling people talked about, more like the moment before a storm when the air just stops. "Going anywhere," she said again. "We've been married for 7 years. I know how long we've been married. Then explain to me what this means." And he did. Slowly, without cruelty, which she would find later was almost worse than cruelty. He explained that he had met someone, that things had become serious, that Victoria Holloway was the daughter of Franklin Holloway, that this was an opportunity of the kind that didn't come twice. He said it the way someone explains a business decision, calmly, rationally. He said, "She comes from a world I should have been in a long time ago. I think you've always known somewhere that I was meant for more than this." He gestured vaguely at the candles, the table, the life they had made. And then Nathan Reed picked up his keys and walked back out the front door, and the candles burned down slowly in the silence, and the chicken grew cold. Evelyn sat there for a very long time. She didn't cry. She picked up the envelope, opened it. Read every page slowly and carefully, because she had been raised by a man who believed that the worst contracts were the ones you signed without reading. When she was done, she picked up her phone. She scrolled to a number she had not dialed in 7 years. It rang twice. "Ms. Blackwood," said the voice on the other end. "Professional. Ready." "Gerald," she said. "It's time." She set the phone down, looked around the small house, the worn kitchen, the garden through the window, the braid of garlic she'd hung by the back door because she'd read somewhere that it helped keep the humidity out of the pantry. And she let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of everything she was about to leave behind. Then she stood up. She blew out the candles. She walked into the bedroom and pulled a phone from the back of the closet shelf. A different phone, one she hadn't touched in years, and pressed the power button. The screen came on. 63 unread messages, 14 missed calls from board members, analysts, attorneys. A headline from 11 months ago. "Where is Evelyn Blackwood? Heiress still absent as Blackwood." Global Faces hostile acquisition attempt. She read it without expression. Then she opened her contacts and started making calls. By morning, 3 things had happened. The first, a black SUV with tinted windows was parked outside the small house on Craven Street. The second, Gerald Ashworth, her father's former chief legal counsel, and the man who had maintained her holding trust for 7 years, was on a private flight from New York to Savannah. The third, Evelyn Blackwood. Not Carter, not anyone's wife, not the woman who made bad jam and tripped on the same curb 14 times, had already begun the most important negotiation of her life. Not with Nathan, not with anyone on the other side of a table, with herself. The question she was asking wasn't, "How do I destroy him?" The question was something colder and more deliberate. How much of myself am I willing to use? She already knew the answer. All of it. Mrs. Patricia Gaines saw the SUV in the morning while getting her newspaper. She stood on her porch for a moment, looking at it, then at Evelyn's front door. She thought about knocking, but there was something in the stillness of the house, not alarming exactly, but final, that made her think that whatever was happening inside was not something a neighbor's knock could interrupt. She went back inside. She left the tomatoes anyway. Gerald Ashworth was 61 years old and had spent the better part of 4 decades working for the Blackwood family, which meant he had seen things that would make a lesser man consider early retirement and a strong drinking habit. He had sat across from hostile takeover attorneys at 2 in the morning. He had negotiated with men who smiled while they tried to dismantle everything Harold Blackwood had built. He had delivered the news of Charles Blackwood's death to a board of directors that responded with 90 seconds of silence, followed by an immediate argument about succession protocol. He thought he had seen everything. Then Evelyn called him from a town he had to look up on a map, and he realized he had simply been waiting for the chapter that would make all the others feel ordinary. He landed in Savannah at 9:15 in the morning and was in Beaufort by 10:40. The driver, one of the two men Gerald had quietly kept on rotation for 7 years, just in case, pulled up outside a small yellow house with a tired porch and a garden that looked like it had been planted with great enthusiasm and maintained with complete indifference. Gerald stepped out, adjusted his jacket, and looked at the house for a moment. Then the front door opened and Evelyn was standing there, and whatever image he'd been carrying in his head of the young woman who had walked away from everything, something fragile and lost, he supposed, though he'd never said so out loud, dissolved immediately. She was wearing jeans and a plain gray shirt. Her hair was down and not particularly neat. There was a faint smudge of something on her left forearm that might have been ink. She looked tired in the way people look when they haven't slept but have been thinking so hard their whole body feels it. She did not look fragile. She looked like Charles Blackwood's daughter. "You look terrible," Gerald said. "I haven't slept," she said. "Come in. I made coffee." He followed her inside. The house was modest and lived in and smelled like that coffee and something faintly floral. A candle, maybe, or whatever she'd been cooking the night before. He noticed the dining table, the wine glasses still on it, one of them untouched. He did not comment. She poured him a cup and pushed it across the counter, without asking how he took it. Black. He always took it black. And she remembered that the way she remembered most things, quietly and without making a show of it. "Walk me through where we stand," she said, leaning against the counter with her own cup. "All of it. Don't soften anything." Gerald sat down on one of the kitchen stools and opened the leather portfolio he'd brought. "The trust is intact. Your controlling stake is exactly where we left it. 43% of voting shares, which, with the alignment of the Pennington block, gives you effective majority. The hostile acquisition attempt from Crane Capital last year stalled out when they couldn't get the financing together, but they're still circling. There are also 2 board members, Whitfield and the newer one, Marcus Pruitt, who have been pushing for a formal declaration of incapacitation to trigger the succession clause. On what grounds? Prolonged absence. They've been building a case that your 7-year disappearance constitutes abandonment of fiduciary responsibility." Evelyn's expression didn't change much, a slight tightening around the eyes. "Whitfield, I expected. Who brought in Pruitt?" "We believe Holloway." She was quiet for a moment. "Franklin Holloway. His firm has been quietly accumulating secondary shares through 3 shell entities for the past 18 months. If Pruitt and Whitfield succeed in triggering the succession clause, the remaining board structure favors a sale. Holloway would have the capital to move." She set her cup down. "So while Nathan was busy falling in love with Holloway's daughter, Holloway himself was trying to steal my company." Gerald looked at her steadily. "That is an accurate summary, yes." She almost laughed. Not from humor exactly, but from the particular absurdity of it. The way the pieces fit together in a pattern so ugly, it was almost elegant. Her husband had been sleeping with the daughter of the man who was methodically dismantling the empire she'd walked away from. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it had teeth. "How long before the succession clause hearing?" "The board has called a special session, 6 weeks. "I need 4. "For what?" "To make sure that by the time I walk into that room, no one in it has any doubt about who I am or what I'm prepared to do." Gerald studied her for a moment. He had a habit, when he was processing something important, of very slightly tilting his head to the right. A tic Evelyn remembered from boardroom meetings she'd attended as a teenager, standing beside her father and trying to look like she belonged there. "There's something else," he said. "Tell me. Your reemergence will be news. Significant news. The financial press has been speculating about Blackwood's leadership vacuum for 3 years. When you surface, it will not be quiet." "I know. Nathan Reed will find out who you are." "I know that too." And Victoria Holloway's engagement announcement ran in the Times business section last week. That landed differently than the rest. Not devastatingly. She had expected it, had known it was coming the moment she read those divorce papers, but with a particular kind of dull ache that surprised her by showing up at all. She had thought she was past it. She was mostly past it. But grief had a way of finding the small gaps you thought you'd sealed. She picked up her coffee again. How long has the engagement been in the works? Speculation suggests at least 4 months. 4 months. She counted backward without meaning to, the way the mind insists on doing things you've told it not to. 4 months ago, she had been making jam in this kitchen. Nathan had been sitting at that table reading something on his laptop. They had talked about whether to get the back fence repaired before summer. She had thought everything was difficult but survivable. She set the thought down firmly, like closing a drawer. "Book me an apartment in the city," she said. "Somewhere quiet. Not a hotel. I need to be able to work without the front desk knowing my schedule. And I need you to set up a meeting with Diane Reyes." Gerald raised an eyebrow slightly. "Reyes is in Hong Kong. Then she'll need to fly back." Diane Reyes was the woman Evelyn's father had once called the most dangerous attorney in the country, which coming from Charles Blackwood meant something specific. She was 72, still sharp, still feared, and had been Blackwood Global's outside litigation counsel for 30 years. If there was going to be a board battle, Evelyn wanted Diane in the room. "I'll make the call," Gerald said. He paused. "One more thing." "Go ahead." "The staff here, the library, the neighbors. Are you planning to explain anything?" She looked around the kitchen, the garlic braid by the back door. The small collection of plants on the windowsill, 2 of which were clearly dying, and 1 of which she had never been able to identify with any confidence. The worn spot on the floor tiles in front of the stove where she'd stood making dinner for 7 years. "No," she said quietly. "I'm going to leave them a note on the library's volunteer board. That's all they're owed." She didn't mean it unkindly. She meant it the way you mean something when the truth of it hurts. "All right," Gerald said, and had the grace not to push further. She walked him back to the door. On the porch, he paused and looked at her with the expression she remembered from after her father's funeral, when he'd been the only person who'd stood beside her without trying to say something helpful. "For what it's worth," he said, "I never believed you'd gone for good." She looked at him. "Why not?" "Because you're the only Blackwood I ever met who actually understood what the company could be, instead of just what it was worth." He picked up his portfolio. "That's rarer than you think." He walked to the car, and Evelyn stood on the porch of her small yellow house for another minute, breathing the salt air, watching the morning light move through the live oaks across the street. Then she went back inside to pack. She didn't take much. She had never been a person who needed much. 2 good suits she'd kept in the back of the closet for reasons she'd never fully examined, as if some part of her had always known or refused to entirely forget. A coat, some books, the small framed photograph of her mother that she kept on the nightstand, taken sometime in the early 80s, before the Blackwood world had finished its work on her. Her mother was laughing at something off camera, and in the photograph she looked like a woman who hadn't been hollowed out yet, and Evelyn had always loved it for that reason. She left the jam in the pantry. She left the gardening gloves on the back step. She left a note for Mrs. Gaines, just a few lines, saying she'd had to leave unexpectedly, that she'd missed the tomatoes, that she hoped the garden did better next year than hers ever had. She did not leave a note for Nathan. She figured the next several months would say everything that needed saying. The black SUV pulled away from Craven Street at 11:23 in the morning, and if any of the neighbors saw it go, none of them mentioned it to each other until later. By the time anyone thought to knock on the door of the yellow house, Evelyn Blackwood was already on a plane. She did not sleep on the flight. She sat with the window shade up, watching the coastline give way to farmland, give way to the gray sprawl of the northeastern corridor. And she thought about her father, and about her grandfather before him, and about all the weight she was about to pick back up. She had spent 7 years putting it down. She wasn't naive enough to think she could carry it the same way now, but she had something she hadn't had at 24. She knew now what she was carrying it for. And it wasn't the company, and it wasn't the money, and it wasn't even revenge, though revenge was certainly part of it, a bright, hard piece of it she wasn't going to pretend didn't exist. It was something simpler and more stubborn than any of that. It was the refusal to be discarded. The apartment Gerald had arranged was in Tribeca, a clean, unfussy floor-through on a quiet block, The kind of place that had good bones and cost a fortune and looked like it cost nothing. Evelyn liked it immediately. She set her bag down, stood at the window for a moment looking at the city, and felt the particular quality of New York press back against her. Not hostile, but indifferent, which in its own way was almost comforting. New York didn't care who you had been or what you'd lost. It was only interested in what you did next. She ordered Thai food and sat on the floor with her laptop and started reading. She read for 6 hours. Board minutes, quarterly reports, investor communications, the 3 independent audits that had been commissioned during her absence, the legal filings related to the Crane Capital attempt, the detailed financial disclosures on the Holloway family's various holding entities. She had always been good at reading financial documents, a skill her father had spent her childhood drilling into her with a consistency he'd never applied to anything resembling emotional warmth, which was probably why she'd retained it. By 2 in the morning, she had a picture. It was not a pretty one. Blackwood Global was still large, still technically profitable, still a name that carried its own gravity in certain rooms. But 7 years of leadership vacuum had taken a toll that the numbers only partially showed. The real damage was cultural, the slow bleed of talent to competitors, the strategic drift that happened when no one at the top was willing to make hard decisions because no one at the top had the authority to make them. The company had been running on legacy and inertia, and both of those were finite resources. The Holloway play made sense now in a way it hadn't fully until she saw the full picture. Franklin Holloway was not interested in running Blackwood. He was interested in breaking it apart and selling the pieces, each of which was worth considerably more separately than the whole had become under these directionless years. It was a clean, cynical calculation, and she could see exactly how he'd worked it. The patience of it, the slow accumulation of leverage, the cultivation of Whitfield and Pruitt. She could also see that he had made one significant error. He had assumed she was gone for good. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while, eating the last of the cold pad Thai from the container, thinking. She thought about Nathan, which she had been mostly avoiding but couldn't entirely. She thought about the specific humiliation of the candles and the good plates and the blue dress, and she let herself feel it without trying to argue it away, because she'd learned a long time ago that you couldn't actually outthink grief. You had to let it move through you and then get out of its way. She had loved him. That was real. What she needed to hold on to now was the understanding that the man who had put those divorce papers on the table was not entirely the man she had loved. The man she'd loved had been in that hardware store, genuine and laughing. Whatever Nathan had become in the years since was a separate thing, a thing she'd watched happen and tried to slow and hadn't been able to, and she was done taking responsibility for it. She was also done crying about it, though in the interest of honesty, she acknowledged she'd done about 3 hours of that in the bathroom before Gerald arrived. And those 3 hours were going to have to carry the weight for everything that came after because she was not planning to revisit them. 3 days after she landed in New York, Diane Reyes arrived. She was a small woman, Diane, compact and precise, with silver hair cut close and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck in a way that managed to look intimidating rather than grandmotherly. She had been practicing law since before some of the current Blackwood board members were born, and she had a quality that Evelyn recognized from her father, the quality of someone who does not waste energy on theater because they know their actual capacity is frightening enough. They met at the apartment. Diane had looked around, looked at Evelyn, and sat down. "You look better than I expected," she said. "Everyone keeps saying that like they thought I'd be arriving in a hospital gown," Evelyn said. "You were gone 7 years. People assumed the worst." "And what did you assume?" Diane smiled slightly. "I assumed you were waiting for something. I just wasn't sure what." "I wasn't waiting. I was living. Then the thing I was living for walked out, so here I am." Diane set her briefcase down. "Tell me what you want. I want to walk into that board session in 4 weeks and leave with the succession clause dead and Whitfield and Pruitt removed for cause. After that, I want Holloway's 3 shell entities flagged to every regulator who has jurisdiction, and I want to know if any of the secondary share acquisitions violated disclosure requirements, because if they did, I want it in front of a judge before the end of the quarter." "And Nathan Reed?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Nathan Reed is a small problem. I'll deal with him separately. He's going to be a story. The press will find the connection between you and him the moment your name surfaces. I know, let them. It could be used to paint you as acting from personal grievance rather than fiduciary interest. Anyone who looks at the board situation will see that Franklin Holloway has been conducting a hostile acquisition campaign for 18 months. The divorce is a coincidence in timeline, not in cause. I'll make that clear. Diane looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating expression of someone who has spent decades measuring people against the things they say and finding them wanting. Apparently, Evelyn passed whatever the test was, because Diane opened her briefcase. "Then let's get to work," she said. The next 3 weeks were unlike anything Evelyn had experienced since her 20s, including the actual experience of her 20s, which had been considerably more chaotic than the 7 quiet years in Beaufort. She worked 18-hour days, not because she was trying to prove something, but because there was genuinely that much to do, and she had always been the kind of person who found momentum more sustainable than pace. She met with Blackwood's current interim executive team, a group of competent, cautious people who had been running the company in committee because no one wanted to be the one who made a decision that the returning heiress would reverse. They were polite to her. A few of them were visibly nervous, in the particular way people get nervous when someone with real authority enters a room for the first time. She was direct with them. She told them she wasn't there to assign blame for the drift of the past 7 years. She had made the choice to be absent, and she understood what that had cost. But that she was there now, she was staying, and she expected the kind of work and the kind of honesty that didn't get cleaned up before it came to her desk. Most of them looked relieved. One of them, a CFO named Robert Hale, a thin, meticulous man who had joined the company 3 years ago, had looked at her with something slightly different. Not hostility, but a careful watchfulness, she noted, and filed away. She met with the Pennington Block, the secondary shareholder group whose alignment was essential to her voting majority. The Penningtons were a family trust run by a 68-year-old woman named Louise Pennington, who wore cashmere sweaters and had the negotiating instincts of a chess grandmaster. They had 2 hours together over lunch at a private dining club on the Upper East Side, and Evelyn came away from it with a firm handshake and the understanding that Louise's support was genuine but not unconditional. It was contingent on a credible strategic plan within the first 90 days. "Your father and I disagreed on many things," Louise had said near the end of lunch. "But I always respected that he understood the company had obligations beyond making money. I'd like to believe you've inherited that understanding." "I have," Evelyn said, "and I'd add that I think those obligations are also the company's most significant untapped value. That's not a moral argument. It's a market argument." Louise had smiled at that. "Good. I'm tired of people who make it only as a moral argument. They're easy to dismiss." And then, 11 days before the board session, the story broke. Not the way Evelyn had anticipated, not through the financial press, not through a controlled announcement, which is what she and Gerald and Diane had been working toward. It broke through a gossip column. Someone at a secondary financial newsletter had put together Nathan Reed's divorce filing, which was public record, with the name Evelyn Carter, and had run a reverse image search on the one photograph Nathan had ever posted of the two of them on social media, a blurry shot from some outdoor event 3 years ago. The match wasn't certain, but it was enough. By morning, it was everywhere. Blackwood heiress found. Lived as ordinary wife for 7 years. Husband filed for divorce 2 weeks ago. The framing was exactly what Diane had warned about. Sympathetic on the surface, with a soft undertone of implication, the suggestion that Evelyn's return was emotional rather than strategic, a woman scorned rather than a woman with a plan. Financial analysts quoted on cable news segments discussed whether a recently divorced heiress acting from what one of them delicately called personal disruption was the right person to be steering a company of Blackwood's scale. Evelyn watched approximately 4 minutes of this on her laptop before closing it. "Let it run," she told Diane, who had called within 2 minutes of the story going live. "Don't issue anything, don't deny anything. I'll make my first statement at the board session and not before." "Nathan Reed has been contacted by at least 3 news outlets," Diane said. "What's he saying?" "Nothing yet. He's gone quiet." "He's talking to a publicist," Evelyn said. "Or Victoria's family is. Either way, anything he says from this point forward is managed, and managed statements smell like managed statements. It'll be fine." She was mostly right about that. What she hadn't fully accounted for was the call she got 2 days later from a number she didn't recognize. which she almost didn't answer, and which turned out to be Nathan. She stood in the middle of the apartment's main room and looked at the screen for a full 4 rings while she decided. She answered on the 5th. "Evelyn?" His voice was different. The rehearsed flatness was gone. He sounded like someone who had spent a couple of days being rattled and was still rattled. "I need you to understand that I didn't know." She was quiet. "About Blackwood. About who you were. I had no idea, and I need you to know that because the way this is being reported, Nathan," she said, "makes it look like I knew something and I didn't, and I think people are going to—" "Nathan," he stopped. "I believe you," she said. "That you didn't know. I never told you. I made that choice, and it had consequences I have to live with too." A pause. "Then why— But I also believe," she continued, "that what you did had nothing to do with who I turned out to be. You didn't leave a poor woman because she was poor. You left the specific woman who was in front of you because you decided she wasn't enough. That would have been true, regardless of the money." The silence on his end was different now. "I'm not calling to hurt you," she said, and meant it. "I'm not even calling this revenge exactly. I'm calling it consequences. The kind that exist whether or not I'm in the picture. What Holloway has been doing to my company was happening before your divorce papers landed on my table. I would have come back eventually." "Evelyn, don't call this number again," she said. "Please." She ended the call. She stood there for a moment in the quiet apartment holding the phone and noticed with some detachment that her hand was very slightly unsteady. Not from anger, from the specific effort of meaning every word you say to someone and still having to say it. She set the phone on the counter. She went to the window. Outside, New York was doing what it always did, insistent and indifferent and enormous. And she watched it for a while until her hand steadied. Then she went back to work. There was a board session in 9 days, and Franklin Holloway had no idea what was about to happen to him. That, at least, was something she could feel straightforwardly good about. The day before the session, Gerald came to the apartment with the final prepared materials, the full briefing package that Diane's team had assembled, the documented evidence of the shell entity acquisitions, the timeline of Whitfield and Pruitt's coordination with the Holloway camp, and the strategic plan outline she would present to the board as proof that her return was operational, not emotional. He set it all on the table and looked at her. "How are you sleeping?" he asked. 4 hours? Maybe 5. That's not enough. It's what's available. He nodded, accepting that. Then, your father, the week before a big board session, used to eat an entire sleeve of crackers at 2 in the morning, just standing in the kitchen. He thought no one knew. Evelyn looked at him. Did everyone know? Everyone knew. She almost laughed. Actually laughed. A short, real one. "I've been eating cereal at midnight. Dry. Out of the box." "There it is," Gerald said. "The Blackwood tell." She shook her head, still almost smiling, and looked at the stack of documents on the table. Tomorrow, she was going to walk into a room full of people who had spent 7 years betting she wouldn't come back, and she was going to prove every single one of them wrong. She picked up the briefing package. She started reading. The Blackwood Global boardroom occupied the 44th floor of a building on Park Avenue that her grandfather had purchased in 1971 and her father had renovated twice, most recently in 2009 with the kind of aggressive minimalism that communicated power through what it removed rather than what it displayed. The table was long and dark and serious. The chairs were leather and uncomfortable in the specific way expensive chairs are often uncomfortable, as if the discomfort itself was part of the message. The windows faced south, and on a clear morning, the light came in at an angle that made everything look like it was being examined. Evelyn had sat in this room as a child, quietly, in the chair along the wall that was designated for observers. She had sat in it as a teenager and tried to look like she understood everything being said, which she mostly did, and tried to look like it didn't frighten her, which it sometimes did. She had sat in it at 22 as her father's designated successor and watched grown men in expensive suits perform elaborate theater around the word deference while meaning something closer to the opposite. She had not sat in it for 7 years. She arrived 12 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin, which was deliberate. Not early enough to seem anxious, not late enough to make an entrance, which would have been theatrical in a way she didn't need. The facts were theatrical enough on their own. She wore a charcoal suit she'd had made in the city the previous week, well cut and unremarkable, and she carried nothing except a single leather portfolio and the particular quality of stillness that her father had once told her was the most important thing a Blackwood could bring into a difficult room. "Anyone can be loud," he'd said when she was about 15 and they were arguing about something she no longer remembered. "Loud is easy, still is hard. Learn to be still when everything around you is moving, and you will always be the most dangerous person in the room." She had resented that advice at the time, because she had resented most of what her father told her, and because she was 15 and resentment was the primary available currency. She understood it now. Gerald was already in the room when she arrived, seated along the wall in one of the observer chairs. Diane Reyes was at the far end of the table in the counsel position, silver-haired and composed and radiating the particular energy of someone who has been in more consequential rooms than this one and found them all manageable. The board members filed in over the next 10 minutes. Some of them she knew. Margaret Cho, who had been on the board since her father's time, and who had sent Evelyn a handwritten note every year for 7 years at her official address. Notes that had been forwarded to a post office box in Savannah that Gerald checked quarterly. Margaret looked at Evelyn now with an expression that was relief and something slightly reproachful at the same time. The expression of someone who had been worried and was not entirely ready to stop being worried just because the thing they worried about had resolved. Thomas Aldridge, who managed the International Holdings portfolio and had a reputation for being aggressively neutral in internal politics, gave her a careful nod that communicated nothing and everything simultaneously. And then Richard Whitfield. He was 64, silver-haired in the way of men who had always planned to be silver-haired, with a square jaw and the kind of permanent tan that came from a lot of time in places warm enough to have it. He had been on the Blackwood board for 9 years, appointed during a period when her father had been ill and making some decisions that a healthier version of him might have examined more carefully. He had always been cordial to Evelyn in the years before she left, with the specific cordiality of someone who has calculated that cordiality is the most strategically useful position. He sat down across from her and met her eyes and smiled. It was a very controlled smile. Evelyn smiled back. Neither of them meant it, and both of them knew it, and the understanding moved between them across the table like something being formally acknowledged. Marcus Pruitt came in last, which she suspected was intentional. An attempt to project ease, the latecomer who doesn't feel the need to hurry because they're confident in their position. He was younger than the others, 47, with a background in private equity and the slightly too polished quality of someone who had been coached on boardroom manner relatively recently. He took his seat, looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone who had prepared what they were going to say, and said nothing yet. The session was called to order by Margaret Cho, who as the longest-serving member was chairing in the absence of a sitting CEO. "I believe," Margaret said with a precision that was itself a kind of statement, "that we can dispense with the standard opening formalities given the circumstances. Ms. Blackwood has requested the floor," Whitfield said before Evelyn could speak. "I'd like to note for the record that the legitimacy of Ms. Blackwood's standing to address this board is precisely the question before us today. The succession clause petition—" "The petition," Diane said from her end of the table, not raising her voice at all, "is the second item on today's agenda. Ms. Blackwood's standing is not in question under the current bylaws, which I'm happy to walk through for anyone who needs the refresher." A beat of silence. "Miss Blackwood," Margaret said. Evelyn opened her portfolio. She didn't look at her notes. She had read them enough times in the past 48 hours that they were part of her now, and looking at them in this room would communicate the wrong thing. "I'll be brief about the personal," she said, "because the personal isn't why we're here. 7 years ago, I made a choice to step back from active management for reasons that were my own. I structured that absence carefully, through the holding trust, in a way that preserved the company's ownership integrity and my voting stake. That structure was legal, documented, and was signed off on by the company's own counsel at the time." She paused and looked around the table. "I am back now. I intend to remain. And I would like to address, before we discuss the succession clause petition, a separate matter that I believe the board will find significantly more urgent." She nodded at Gerald, who opened his own portfolio and began distributing the packets Diane's team had prepared. A clean, precise document, 42 pages, with the evidence organized chronologically, and each claim sourced with the relevant filing or financial disclosure. Pruitt looked down at the packet in front of him, and his expression shifted in a way he didn't quite manage to control. Something tightened around his eyes, a quick flash of the calculation happening behind them. Whitfield picked up his packet with the deliberate calm of someone who had been expecting something, but not this specific something. "What is this?" he said. Not quite a question. "That," Evelyn said, "is a documented record of 3 shell entities: Carlyle Asset Partners, the Meridian Trust, and a holding vehicle registered in Delaware under the name Voss Capital LLC, which have been systematically acquiring Blackwood's secondary shares over the past 18 months. All 3 entities, when traced through their registration structures, connect to a parent holding company associated with Franklin Holloway's family office." She let that sit for a moment. The acquisition pattern, combined with the timing of the succession clause petition and the specific coordination between certain board members and Holloway's advisory team, which we have documented through communications that will be provided to the SEC and the relevant state financial regulators as of this afternoon, constitutes what our counsel believes is a strong case for a coordinated attempt to use internal governance mechanisms to facilitate a predatory acquisition. In plain language, someone has been trying to steal this company while I was gone, and 2 of the people in this room helped them. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Margaret Cho was looking at Whitfield. Thomas Aldridge had set down his copy of the packet and was looking at the table with the expression of a man who is rapidly revising his understanding of a situation he thought he had a handle on. Whitfield said, "These are serious allegations, and I would advise the room—" "They're not allegations," Diane said. "They're findings. There's a meaningful difference, and I'd encourage you to be careful about which word you use in a room that has a recorder running." Whitfield looked at Diane, and for just a moment his composure cracked enough that the thing underneath showed, not guilt exactly, but the particular expression of someone who has gambled on a specific outcome and is watching the odds recalculate in real time. "I'd like a recess," Pruitt said. "Not yet," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "We're going to finish this session," she said. "We're going to vote on the succession clause petition, which will fail, and then we are going to vote on a motion I'm introducing today to remove Mr. Whitfield and Mr. Pruitt from the board for cause, pending the outcome of the regulatory review. After that, if you'd like a recess, you're welcome to one." The vote on the succession clause was not close. With the Pennington block in alignment and 3 of the remaining 5 independent board members voting with Evelyn, the petition failed 7-2, the 2 being Whitfield and Pruitt, who were the only ones still trying to pretend the ground hadn't shifted under them. The removal motion passed 6-2. Whitfield and Pruitt abstained from their own removal vote, which Diane had anticipated and which was legally irrelevant. Whitfield gathered his materials with the careful movements of a man holding himself together through the specific discipline of physical precision. At the door, he stopped and looked back at Evelyn. "Your father," he said, "was a difficult man, but he was a rational one. I hope you understand what you're starting." "I hope you understand what you already started," she said. "I'm just finishing it." He left. The room held its breath for a moment after the door closed, and then something released, like the pressure change when a storm finally breaks. Margaret Cho looked at Evelyn across the table, and this time the relief in her expression was uncomplicated. "Welcome back," she said, and it came out with more feeling than Margaret probably intended, because Margaret was not a woman given to sentiment in boardrooms, and the fact that she hadn't managed to keep the feeling entirely out of her voice said something. "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I need to ask the board for 60 days to develop the strategic review I'll be presenting as the basis for the operational plan. I want honest assessments from each division head, no cleaned-up numbers, no optimistic projections, just the actual picture." "You'll have what you need," Thomas Aldridge said. "One more thing." She looked around the table. "I know that the past 7 years have been difficult for the people who were here keeping this company running without clear direction from the top. I don't take that for granted, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't a failure of leadership on my part, regardless of the reasons behind it. What I need from this board going forward is direct communication. If you disagree with something I'm doing, I need to hear it in this room, not in a phone call to a third party. I've seen what the alternative looks like." A few nods around the table. genuine ones. The session ended at 12:47 p.m. In the elevator going down, Gerald stood beside her and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Your father would have done it with more theater." "I know," she said. "It was better this way." She looked at him. He was staring at the elevator doors, not quite smiling. She looked at the doors too. "Don't tell me that too many times. I might start believing it." The news of the board session's outcome moved fast. By 3 in the afternoon, the financial press had the broad strokes. Succession clause defeated, 2 board members removed, regulatory referral filed. By 5, the more detailed analyses were appearing, the ones written by people who had actually read the Holloway acquisition trail and understood what it meant. The framing shifted. The woman-scorned returns to company narrative collided with the coordinated hostile acquisition attempt exposed narrative, and the second one was substantially more interesting from a financial news perspective, which meant it won. By the following morning, the story was primarily about Franklin Holloway, which was exactly where Evelyn had wanted it. She did not celebrate. Not because she wasn't relieved. She was deeply, in the way that relief comes when you've been bracing for impact, and the impact turns out to be survivable. But there was too much work ahead to spend time on celebration, and she had never been particularly good at it anyway. Her father hadn't believed in celebration. He believed in the next thing. It was one of his worst qualities, and also one of the most useful things he'd passed on to her, and she had long since given up trying to feel uncomplicated about it. What she did instead was work. She moved through the company's divisions over the following weeks with a directness that surprised some people and alarmed others. She had meetings with division heads that ran long because she asked the kind of questions that required honest answers, and honest answers took time. She found what she expected to find: pockets of genuine capability that had been underutilized, structural inefficiencies that had calcified during the years of directionless management, and a few significant problems that people had been hoping would resolve themselves and had not. Robert Hale, the CFO, with the careful, watchful quality she'd noted in their first meeting, turned out to be more complex than she'd initially read him. He came to her 3 weeks after the board session, not with a prepared presentation, but with a single document, 2 pages, handwritten notes, which she found unexpectedly disarming. "The Renewable Infrastructure Division," he said, sitting across from her in her office, "has been running at a loss for 2 years, but it's not because the division is failing. It's because someone had made a capital allocation decision in 2022 that starved the division of the resources it needed to hit its targets, and then used the underperformance as justification for further cuts. It's a cycle that was started deliberately. Deliberately by whom? Whitfield had strong opinions about the division. He felt sustainable infrastructure was a distraction from core returns. She looked at the handwritten notes. "You kept records." "I keep records of everything," he said. "It's a habit. I wasn't sure for a while whether it was the right call or not." "It was the right call," she said. He nodded carefully. "I should tell you, I voted against you initially. When Pruitt first started building the case for the succession clause, I thought there was a reasonable argument that the company needed certainty. That wasn't cynicism. That was a genuine concern." She appreciated that he said it. It would have been easier not to. "And now? Now I think I was given incomplete information and allowed myself to be managed by people who had an agenda I didn't fully see." He paused. "I don't know if that's worse or better." "It's human," she said. "What I need from you going forward is what you just did. Come to me with the actual picture, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable." "I can do that," he said. She believed him. The renewable infrastructure situation became the first significant strategic decision she made as acting CEO, a formal title she'd taken on with the board's approval pending a more complete governance review. She authorized a capital reallocation that restored the division's operating budget and brought in an outside assessment team to evaluate its pipeline. She did it over the objections of 2 institutional investors who issued statements expressing concern about capital deployment priorities, and she dealt with those concerns the way her father had dealt with similar ones, by calling each investor directly and making the case herself, which most people in her position considered beneath them, and which she had always found was the single most effective tool available. She was not her father. She knew that, had spent years knowing it and in some ways resenting that the comparison was always waiting. But she was also not the careful, self-erasing version of herself she'd been in Beaufort. The woman who'd clipped coupons and made bad jam and pretended that wanting less was the same as wanting nothing. She was something in between, she thought, something that had been formed by both of those lives and neither of them entirely. It was not a comfortable thing to be, but it was honest. The Holloway situation developed more slowly, the way regulatory and legal processes always do, grinding forward with the particular momentum of institutions that are large and slow-moving, but once in motion, very difficult to redirect. Franklin Holloway issued a statement through his public relations team denying any impropriety in the share acquisitions and characterizing the SEC referral as a politically motivated misuse of governance mechanisms. It was a well-written statement. It said nothing. His attorneys filed 3 separate motions attempting to have the regulatory review narrowed or delayed. Diane batted them away with the efficiency of someone playing a game they had played many times before. The engagement between Nathan and Victoria Holloway was quietly dissolved, a 2-line statement in the business section of the same publication that had announced it, which Evelyn did not read directly, but which Gerald mentioned to her in passing and which she received without comment. She thought about Nathan less than she expected to. That wasn't entirely true. There were moments, usually late at night when the apartment was quiet and the work had reached a natural pause, when she thought about the specific texture of the life she'd left behind in Beaufort, the way the salt air came in off the water in the mornings, Mrs. Gaines's tomatoes, the worn spot on the kitchen floor, the way things had felt for a long time, genuinely small and genuinely good. She did not regret those years. That was the thing she kept arriving at when she let herself examine it honestly. She had needed them. She had been 24 and exhausted from growing up in a house where love and power had been so thoroughly mixed that she couldn't untangle them, and she had needed to live in a place where neither of those things was trying to consume her. What she regretted, what she allowed herself to name as regret, which was different from guilt, and she worked to keep the distinction clear, was the concealment. Not telling Nathan who she was. She had told herself it was protection, and it was, but protection and honesty were not always compatible, and she had chosen protection and paid the cost of it. She had also, she admitted to herself, used the secret as a test she'd never told him he was taking. Some part of her had been watching all those years to see if the love was clean, if it would hold without the weight of the name and the money. When it didn't hold, she had told herself it proved the test mattered. What it actually proved was that tests aren't a substitute for honesty, and she had known that and done it anyway. It was not a comfortable conclusion, but she'd spent enough of her life avoiding uncomfortable conclusions. She was trying to stop. 6 weeks after the board session, she was sitting in her office at 9 in the evening, a habit she was aware was not sustainable and was attempting to be semi-aware of before it became completely unsustainable, when her assistant knocked. "A Mr. Julian Cross is downstairs," her assistant said. "He doesn't have an appointment. He says he has a proposal for the Renewable Infrastructure Division and that you'll want to hear it." Did he say why he thinks I'll want to hear it? He said, and I'm quoting, that he's been trying to get a meeting with someone at Blackwood for 14 months, and the answer has always been no, and that the previous people who said no were wrong, and that he would like the opportunity to be told no by someone who actually has the authority to make that call. Evelyn considered that for a moment. "Send him up," she said. Julian Cross was 38 and did not look like the founder of a sustainable technology company, which is to say he did not look like he was performing the role of someone important. He was medium height and slightly rumpled, with dark hair that needed cutting and the particular quality of alertness in his eyes that comes from being genuinely interested in things, rather than performing interest in things. He was carrying a laptop bag that had seen better days and a cup of coffee that he'd apparently brought from somewhere downstairs. He sat down across from her without being asked, looked around the office briefly and said, "I appreciate you seeing me." "You made a decent pitch," she said. "What's the proposal?" He opened the laptop bag. The short version, my company, Meridian Green Systems, has developed a modular infrastructure technology for distributed energy networks that has been waiting 2 years for a capital partner with the asset base and the real estate holdings to deploy it at scale. Blackwood has both. Every meeting I've had here before today has ended with someone telling me the company doesn't have a clear strategic direction on sustainability, which has been true and which I understand is changing. Who told you it was changing? The financial press, he said, and the capital reallocation announcement last month, and the fact that you fired the two board members who were actively undermining the division. Removed, she said, for cause. Right. He almost smiled. I read the distinction. She looked at him for a moment. There was something direct about him that she didn't find annoying, which was not always the case with people who were direct. He wasn't performing confidence. He just appeared to actually have some, in the specific form that comes from knowing your work is good and being tired of having to apologize for saying so. Send me the full technical documentation, she said, and the financials. I'll have my team review it by end of next week. That's the fastest turnaround I've gotten in 14 months, he said. Don't read too much into it. My team might hate it. Your team might, he said, but you won't. She looked at him. You're confident. About the technology, yes. About everything else, considerably less so. He stood, picked up the laptop bag. Thank you for the time. He walked out, and Evelyn sat for a moment looking at the door he'd closed behind him and noticed that the particular heaviness of the late evening, the weight that had been sitting in the office since about 7, had lifted slightly. She wasn't sure what to do with that exactly. She filed it under things to examine later, which was where she put everything she wasn't ready to examine now, and turned back to the document on her screen. But the lightness stayed, quiet and uninvited, for the rest of the night. Outside, on the 43rd floor, the city moved through its late evening rhythms. The tail end of the financial district's long day, the lights of other towers, the distant sound of the street 44 floors below. New York in September, cooling down after the humidity of summer, smelling like concrete, and something almost like fall. Evelyn worked until midnight. She ate cereal out of the box standing in the small kitchen of the apartment, which she would not admit to anyone and which felt, in its smallness and its ridiculousness, briefly like something from her own life rather than from the life she was constructing. She went to bed at 12:30. She slept for 5 hours, which was better than usual. It was not enough, but it was what was available, and she had long since made her peace with working with what was available. Tomorrow there was a meeting with the International Division heads and a call with Louise Pennington, and a deposition preparation session with Diane's team related to the Holloway regulatory matter. The day after that, Julian Cross's documentation would arrive. She hadn't decided yet what she would find when she looked at it, but she had already decided, without fully acknowledging it, that she was going to look carefully. Julian Cross's documentation arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 days after he'd walked out of her office with his battered laptop bag and his matter-of-fact confidence. And it arrived not as the polished deck Evelyn had been expecting, but as a folder containing 47 separate files. Technical schematics, field test data, financial models with 3 different scenario builds, a 12-page narrative explaining the technology's development history, and a cover note that said simply, "Everything we have. No edits for audience. You asked for the actual picture." She had in fact not said those exact words to him. She had said them to her board. He had apparently read enough about the board session to understand they applied more broadly. She sat with the documentation for most of that Thursday, reading the way she read everything that mattered, slowly, going back over sections that didn't immediately resolve, making notes in the margins of the printed pages because she thought better with a pen in her hand, and had stopped apologizing for that particular inefficiency. Robert Hale's team had already flagged the Renewable Infrastructure Division's pipeline gaps in their assessment. What Julian's documentation showed was that Meridian Green Systems had been quietly, stubbornly solving exactly those gaps for 2 years with about 1/10 of the capital that Blackwood's own internal teams had spent producing reports about why the gaps existed. The technology itself was not magic. She had enough technical grounding to know when someone was overselling, and she'd read enough optimistic infrastructure proposals to recognize the particular shape of projection that assumed perfect conditions and ignored friction. Julian's models didn't do that. They had failure scenarios built in. They had conservative adoption curves. They had honest assessments of regulatory timeline risk in 3 of the key markets. The honest assessments of risk were, paradoxically, the thing that made her trust the rest of it. She called Robert Hale at 4 in the afternoon. "Have you looked at the Meridian Green documentation?" she said. "Got through about 2/3 of it this morning," he said. "I was going to call you." "What's your read?" A pause. Technically, it's the best thing I've seen come through this office in 3 years. The modular deployment model is genuinely different from what the division has been trying to build internally. Financially, another pause, and she could hear him weighing his words. The capital requirement is significant, not prohibitive, but it's a real number. What's the number? To do the first deployment phase properly, with the buffer you'd need to absorb the regulatory timeline variance he's flagged, I'd want to see a commitment somewhere between 280 and 320 million over 18 months. She was quiet for a moment. The institutional investors who objected to the first reallocation are going to have opinions about that, she said. Loud ones, Robert said. Particularly Vance Capital. They've already been in contact with my office about the Q3 capital deployment report. What did you tell them? That the report would be ready on schedule and that any strategic announcements would come through appropriate channels. Good. She looked at the cover note on top of Julian's folder. No edits for audience. I want to meet with Cross again. Set it up for next week. And I want you in the room. I'll arrange it, Robert said. Then carefully, can I ask a question that's slightly outside my lane? Go ahead. Is the interest in Meridian purely strategic? She understood what he was asking. She also understood that Robert Hale, who kept handwritten records and came to her with uncomfortable truths, had earned the right to ask questions slightly outside his lane. I think the technology is genuinely important, she said. Whether there's anything else, I haven't decided. Fair enough, he said. He did not push further, which she appreciated. The meeting with Julian happened on a Tuesday, in a conference room on the 42nd floor rather than her office, with Robert present and 2 members of the technical team from the Renewable Infrastructure Division. Julian arrived 5 minutes early this time, which she noticed, and he had brought a colleague, a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who had apparently led the field testing in the Southeast Asia deployment pilot, and who had the compressed, precise manner of someone who has spent a great deal of time explaining complex things to people who needed to understand them quickly. The meeting ran 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was 90 minutes longer than Evelyn had blocked for it. It ran long because Julian and Priya knew their material without performing their knowledge of it, which meant the conversation moved fast and sideways in the productive way good technical conversations do, where one answer opens 3 more questions, and the questions are actually useful rather than defensive. It ran long because Robert's team had questions that deserved real answers and got them. It ran long because at one point Evelyn pulled out the printed documentation with her margin notes, and Julian looked at the pages and said, almost to himself, "You actually read all of it." And she said, "I read everything I'm considering spending $300 million on." And he'd looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between startled and something else she didn't try to name. At the end of the meeting, when Priya and Robert's team had filtered out, and it was the 2 of them left with the remains of the conference table coffee and a whiteboard that had accumulated more diagrams than either of them had intended, Julian said, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking the second scenario build is the most realistic, and that the regulatory timeline in the Malaysian market is probably optimistic by about 4 months based on what I know about the current ministry structure there. We have a contact in the ministry who disagrees. Get me that contact's name, and I'll make my own assessment." He looked at her. "You know people in the Malaysian Energy Ministry. My company has infrastructure interests in 6 Southeast Asian markets. Yes." "Right." He said it with the specific quality of someone recalibrating. "I keep forgetting the scale of what I'm sitting across from." "Don't," she said. "It makes the conversation worse." "Fair point." He started gathering his materials. "Does this move forward?" "I'll have a formal response by the end of the week. The Capital Committee meets Thursday." He nodded. He was about to say something else and then appeared to decide against it. He picked up his bag. "Cross," she said. He stopped. "The note on the documentation. No edits for audience." "Yes." "That was deliberate." "Everything I write is deliberate," he said. "I figured if you'd fired 2 board members for hiding things, you probably wanted the same standard from anyone else you were thinking about working with." She looked at him for a moment. "Where did you read about the board session?" 4 different publications. Also, Gerald Ashworth mentioned, when I called his office to get the meeting, that you had a particular preference for honesty. He seemed to think it was relevant. She made a note to thank Gerald and also to possibly have a conversation with him about what he said to strangers on the phone. "All right, end of the week." He left. She sat in the conference room for a moment with the empty coffee cups and the marked-up whiteboard, and allowed herself to notice that she felt, for the first time in several months, something that was close to genuinely interested in what came next. Not strategically interested, not urgently interested, just interested, the way you are when something has possibilities that aren't entirely predictable. It was a small thing. She went back to work. The Capital Committee approved the Meridian Partnership in principle on Thursday, with conditions that Robert had helped structure, and that were reasonable enough that Julian's team accepted them within 24 hours. The formal partnership agreement took 3 more weeks to finalize. 3 weeks of back and forth between legal teams that was tedious in the way all contract negotiation is tedious, which is to say completely, and which Evelyn monitored without involving herself indirectly because she had learned the hard way that being the CEO who inserts herself into contract drafting at the clause level makes lawyers nervous and slows everything down. While that was grinding forward, the Holloway regulatory matter was accelerating. The SEC's preliminary inquiry had expanded in scope based on the documentation Diane's team had provided, and 2 of the 3 shell entities had received formal document requests. Franklin Holloway had retained the kind of white-shoe defense firm that specialized in making federal inquiries move slowly and expensively, which was both expected and, in its own way, informative. The choice of counsel suggested he was taking the exposure seriously, even while publicly dismissing it. Diane briefed Evelyn on the status every 10 days. The briefings were efficient and largely devoid of editorializing, which was Diane's natural mode. But on a Thursday evening in late October, she said something that wasn't purely operational. "He's going to try to settle," she said, quietly, through intermediaries. "Probably an approach to Gerald first, not to me, because he'll think Gerald is softer." "Gerald is not softer. I know that. Holloway doesn't." A pause. "When the approach comes, and it will come, I need to know what your position is." Evelyn thought about it. "What do you recommend?" "I recommend you decide before you're in the room rather than during it. Settlements have a momentum once they start. If you go in without a clear position, you'll end up negotiating against yourself." "What would a reasonable settlement look like?" "Complete divestiture of the Blackwood secondary shares, financial penalties sufficient to constitute genuine deterrence rather than a cost of doing business, and a formal admission of the coordination with Whitfield and Pruitt. The admission is the part he'll resist most." "Then that's the part I'll hold to," Evelyn said. "The admission." Diane was quiet for a moment. "That may mean no settlement. It may mean full litigation, which is long and expensive and public." "I know. The personal relationship between his family and between the Holloway family and Nathan Reed is going to surface repeatedly in that process." "I know that too. It will be used to argue motivation." "Let them argue it," Evelyn said. "The facts don't change based on what motivated me to find them." Another pause. "All right," Diane said. "Hold the line on the admission." The approach came through Gerald, as Diane had predicted, on the first Monday of November. An attorney Evelyn didn't recognize called Gerald's office requesting a preliminary conversation about potential resolution of outstanding matters. Gerald, who was not softer, told the attorney that any such conversation would need to be conducted through Diane Reyes's office and that the conversation would not be preliminary. It would be substantive and recorded. The attorney said he would need to consult with his client. Gerald said that was fine and hung up. He reported this to Evelyn with the expression of someone describing a mildly interesting weather event. "Did you enjoy that?" she asked. "Moderately," he said. She didn't hear from the Holloway attorneys for another 2 weeks. What arrived instead, unexpectedly, was Nathan. Not a phone call this time. A letter, paper, handwritten, addressed to the Blackwood Global offices, which meant he'd looked up the address, which meant he'd thought about it enough to do something physical, rather than something that could be deleted or ignored. Her assistant brought it in one morning with the rest of the correspondence, and Evelyn looked at the handwriting on the envelope for a long moment before opening it. It was 2 pages. He had not hired anyone to help him write it. She could tell because it was not clean. It went back on itself. It contradicted itself in one place in a way that seemed unintentional. There were 2 crossed-out words on the second page. It was the writing of someone who had been carrying something for months and had finally put it down on paper without fully knowing what shape it would take. He wrote that he had spent a great deal of time thinking about the conversation they'd had when he'd called her apartment, the one she'd ended by telling him not to call again. He wrote that he didn't disagree with what she'd said, that he understood the divorce had been about her as an individual, not about her money, and that he'd been trying to untangle those two things for months and kept arriving at the same uncomfortable place. He wrote that he wasn't asking for anything. He wrote that he thought she deserved to know that he understood, now, that what he'd done to her on their anniversary was one of the worst things he'd ever done to another person, and that Victoria had been a symptom of something broken in him that he was trying to understand rather than a cause. He wrote that he'd started seeing a therapist, which he included with the particular awkwardness of someone who still finds the sentence slightly embarrassing to say out loud. He wrote, "I know you don't owe me anything. I'm not writing because I think you do. I'm writing because I think you spent 7 years being careful about who you were and what you showed people, and some of that was because of me. Because you were waiting to see if I was worth it. I wasn't. I wanted you to know that I know that, not because it changes anything, just because it seems like you should know that it's not something I got away with thinking differently about." He didn't ask her to respond. She sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about the man in the hardware store, and about the worn spot on the kitchen floor, and about the fact that people were capable of being several things at once, capable of genuine love and genuine failure, capable of cruelty that came not from malice, but from a smaller and more pathetic place, the place where ambition sours and becomes something you can't quite recognize as yourself until someone else pays the cost of it. She thought about what it had taken him to write those 2 pages. She thought about her own accounting, the test she'd set him without telling him, the identity she'd concealed, the way she'd shaped her own life in Beaufort partly around the need to be loved without the name, which was real and valid, and partly around a fear of being seen that she hadn't fully admitted to herself until recently. She got out a piece of paper. She wrote 3 sentences. "I received your letter. I believe you mean it. Take care of yourself." She mailed it that afternoon. She did not tell anyone she had written it, not Gerald, not Diane. Some things were just between the 2 people who had lived them, and this was one of those things. And she had reached an age where she no longer felt the need to narrate every private decision to someone else. The Holloway matter reached its critical point in December. The SEC's formal investigation had generated enough documented evidence that Franklin Holloway's attorneys could no longer credibly argue the shell entity acquisitions were unrelated to the succession clause coordination. The financial penalties being discussed were substantial. What remained in contention was the admission, the formal acknowledgement of coordination, the one Evelyn had told Diane to hold the line on. Holloway's side pushed back hard. They offered higher financial penalties in lieu of the admission. They offered structural concessions on the share divestiture. They offered, in one creative late-night proposal from their legal team, a joint statement that used language carefully engineered to imply acknowledgement without technically constituting one. Diane sent back a 4-word response. "The admission is required." The back and forth lasted 3 weeks. Through Thanksgiving, through the first week of December, while Evelyn worked and the Meridian Partnership Agreement finalized, and the Renewable Infrastructure Division began the first phase of deployment planning, and the company's stock price, which had been quietly ascending since the board session outcome became public, hit a 12-month high. On a Wednesday evening in the second week of December, Diane called. "He's going to sign," she said. Evelyn was at her desk. Outside the window, the city had gone dark in the way it did in December, early and absolute, with the lights of the buildings making a kind of grid against it. All of it. All of it. The divestiture, the penalties, the admission. His attorneys are exhausted and his investors are getting nervous, and I think, frankly, that he realized we were prepared to take it to full litigation, and he wasn't. "When does he sign?" "We're targeting Friday." She looked at the window for a moment. "All right." "Evelyn." Diane almost never used her first name. The effect was noticeable. "This is a significant win." "I know. You're allowed to feel it." She thought about that. "I'll feel it Friday," she said, "after he signs." Diane made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Your father used to say something similar. Don't celebrate the handshake, celebrate the wire transfer." "He wasn't wrong about everything," Evelyn said. On Friday, Franklin Holloway signed. Evelyn was in her office when Gerald brought her the confirmation. He set the document on her desk. She read it once, thoroughly, looking at the admission language specifically, the formal acknowledgement of coordinated conduct, the record that would exist in regulatory filings for as long as regulatory filings existed. She read it twice. Then she put it down. She didn't feel triumphant, exactly. She had expected to feel triumphant, and the fact that she didn't was slightly surprising and not entirely unwelcome. What she felt was something closer to the feeling you get when a long tension finally releases. Not joy exactly, more like the particular quality of ordinary air after you've been holding your breath. Dinner, Gerald said. Tonight. Not a working dinner, an actual one. She looked at him. Are you asking me to dinner? I'm telling you that you're going to dinner. Diane, myself, Robert Hale if he's available, and whoever else you'd like to bring. You have not sat at a table and eaten a meal that was not part of a meeting since September. That's not true. Name one. She opened her mouth, closed it. Exactly, Gerald said. 7 o'clock. I'll make the reservation. She called Julian Cross. Not because she had a professional reason to. The partnership was signed. The deployment planning was underway. There would be plenty of future occasions with professional justification. She called because she had been thinking about the conference room conversation and the cover note, and the particular quality of his attention when he looked at something he found genuinely interesting. And she had made a decision in the small hours of a recent morning that she was going to stop filing things under examine later when what she actually meant was examine when it feels safer, because it was never going to feel safer if she kept waiting for safer. He answered on the second ring. Cross. It's Evelyn Blackwood. A brief pause. Not surprised exactly. More like recalibrating. Is something wrong with the partnership agreement? No, Gerald is making me go to dinner tonight. He has opinions about my eating habits. I thought you might want to come. A longer pause this time. Is this a work dinner? Gerald specifically said it was not a work dinner. Then it's dinner, she said. With people I find tolerable, which is a shorter list than you might think. You're on it, 7 o'clock. I have to move a call, he said. Move the call. Another pause, and she could hear the smile in it before he said anything. All right? She gave him the restaurant name and hung up, and sat for a moment looking at the phone, and noticed that her hand was entirely steady this time. She picked up the Holloway settlement document and put it in the file where it belonged. The dinner was at a restaurant in the West Village that Gerald had chosen with his usual combination of impeccable taste and zero consultation, and it was, by any honest accounting, not entirely a work dinner and not entirely not one. Gerald and Diane spent the first 40 minutes talking through the post-settlement communication strategy in a way that was clearly professional, and then the wine arrived and the conversation became something looser and more human. The way it does when capable people have finished something difficult together and are still sitting in the same room. Robert Hale, who turned out to have strong and surprisingly well-informed opinions about Italian wine, had a quality at the dinner table that Evelyn hadn't seen in the office. Relaxed, dryly funny, the kind of person who was better the less formal the setting was. She filed that away as useful information. Julian arrived 8 minutes late, which he acknowledged by putting the battered laptop bag under his chair and saying, I know, without anyone having said anything, which made Gerald, who had not yet met him in person, look at Evelyn with a very specific expression that she declined to acknowledge. The conversation moved through the Meridian deployment timeline, and then through a completely unrelated argument between Diane and Robert about whether a particular infrastructure project in the 1990s had been a regulatory success or failure, and then somehow to the question of what everyone at the table had wanted to be when they were teenagers, which was the kind of question that comes up when people have had enough wine to find it interesting. Gerald said he'd wanted to be a jazz musician. Everyone believed him. Diane said she'd wanted to be an architect. She said it in a way that made clear she was entirely at peace with having not been one. Robert said he'd wanted to be a marine biologist. He said it with the slightly mournful quality of someone who still occasionally thinks about it. Julian said, I wanted to build something. I didn't know what. I just knew I wanted to make something that existed because I'd put it together, not because someone handed it to me. He said it simply, without drama, looking at his wine glass. Took a while to figure out that energy infrastructure was the answer to that, but here we are. Everyone looked at Evelyn. What? She said. Your turn, Gerald said. She thought about it. I wanted to live somewhere quiet, she said. I wanted a small life, normal things. A beat of silence. Did you get it? Robert asked. He seemed to realize, a half second after asking, that it might be too personal a question. Sorry. For 7 years, she said. Yes. The table was quiet for a moment with that, and then Julian said, not unkindly, and now? She looked at him. Outside the restaurant window, a December rain had started, coming down on the West Village street in a thin silver curtain, the light from the restaurant making it visible. Now, she said, I'm finding out what I want the next version to look like. She meant it. She was not entirely sure what the answer was, which was different from not wanting to find out. 7 years ago, she had needed to know. She had needed certainty the way someone needs a fixed point when the ground is uncertain. She had found it in Beaufort, in the small house, in the worn kitchen floor, in the life she'd built with her own hands instead of inheriting. That version of certainty was gone. But she was different now, too. She was not 24 and running from something. She was 35 and had walked back into the hardest room she knew and stood her ground and come out the other side, and the ground was still there, and she was still standing on it, and that was something. The dinner broke up close to 11. The rain was still going when they stepped outside. Gerald had called cars for everyone with the quiet efficiency that was his signature, and Evelyn stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the damp December air while the others sorted themselves out. Julian came to stand beside her. He hadn't put his coat on yet and was carrying it, which she thought was probably going to result in him being cold in about 30 seconds. Thank you for the call, he said. You moved a call to come, she said. I hope it wasn't important. Everything important can be rescheduled, he said. The stuff that can't be rescheduled is almost never as important as it thinks it is. She looked at him. He was looking at the rain. That's a reasonable philosophy, she said. I have a few of those. Very few. I try not to oversell it. Her car pulled up. She picked up her bag. The deployment site visit is in January, she said. I'm planning to attend. I know, he said. It's in the calendar. I don't usually do site visits. I want you to know that going. He looked at her. The rain was, in fact, making his coat damp, and he still hadn't put it on, and she thought that was very consistent with everything she'd observed about him so far. I know, he said again. I noted the exception. She got in the car. On the way back to the apartment, she looked at the city through the rain-streaked window, the wet streets reflecting the lights, the particular loneliness and aliveness of New York in December, a city that never quite stopped regardless of the weather or the hour. She thought about Beaufort, the salt air, the Spanish moss, the worn kitchen floor, the small good life that had been real while it lasted. She thought about this photograph of her mother, laughing at something off camera, not yet hollowed out. She was going to hang it somewhere better than the nightstand, somewhere she could see it from across the room. She had been meaning to do that for years. Some things you had to decide to stop meaning and start doing. She would do it tomorrow. She hung the photograph on a Sunday morning, not the nightstand wall where it had sat for years in the dim peripheral vision of someone who looks at a thing so often they stop seeing it. She hung it on the wall across from her desk in the apartment at eye level so that when she looked up from her work, she would see her mother's face, the laugh, the light, the woman who had existed before the weight of the Blackwood name had finished its long work on her. It took Evelyn 4 tries to get the hook level. She was, and had always been, genuinely terrible at anything requiring spatial precision and a hammer, a fact that had once made Nathan laugh and now made her laugh alone in the apartment, which was a different kind of thing, but still a real one. She stepped back and looked at the photograph. Her mother had been 31 in that picture, 4 years younger than Evelyn was now. She stood there for a moment with the hammer in her hand, thinking about that, about the strange arithmetic of time, the way you eventually age past the people who raised you, or past the versions of them you carry. Her mother had lived to 63, but the woman in that photograph had been gone much earlier than that, replaced slowly by something quieter and more medicated and more careful, shaped by decades of living inside a world that did not ask her what she needed. Evelyn was 35. She was, by any honest accounting, still figuring out who she was when she wasn't running toward something or away from something. The past several months had been defined by movement, The return, the board session, the Holloway settlement, the Meridian partnership, the grinding work of rebuilding a company that had been left to drift. All of that had given her purpose and structure and the particular forward momentum that kept certain questions at a comfortable distance. Now it was January, the deployment site visit was in 3 days, and on a quiet Sunday morning with a hammer in her hand and her mother's photograph finally on the right wall, those questions had a little more room. She put the hammer away and made coffee and sat at her desk and did not open her laptop. She sat for a while. That was new. The sitting. She had never been a person who sat easily. Her father hadn't been, and she'd inherited his particular restlessness, the sense that stillness was a kind of waste. Beaufort had taught her something different. Beaufort had taught her that sitting in a place without doing something to it was not waste. It was attention. It was the thing that let you actually know where you were. She was trying to bring that understanding into this life, this bigger, louder, more demanding life, and it was harder than she'd expected. The company did not respect stillness. The calendar did not respect stillness. The financial press, which had been running quarterly assessments of her performance with the particular enthusiasm of people watching something they expected to fail and kept being surprised by, definitely did not respect stillness. But she was trying. She looked at her mother's photograph and drank her coffee and let the Sunday morning be what it was. The site visit was in coastal Georgia, 2 hours south of Savannah, where Meridian had identified a former industrial property that met the technical requirements for the first full-scale deployment of the modular energy network. Evelyn drove down with Julian and Priya and 2 members of the infrastructure team in an SUV that Julian drove, which she had not expected and which turned out to involve a playlist that was approximately 60% 90s alternative rock and 40% things she couldn't identify, and a driving style that was competent and slightly aggressive in the way of someone who had spent a lot of time driving to places that were difficult to get to. She sat in the passenger seat. The Georgia coast in January was gray and cold and beautiful, in the particular way of things that aren't trying to be beautiful. The marsh grass flattened by the wind, the water pewter-colored, the sky low and uniform. It reminded her of Beaufort. It reminded her of mornings she had stood on her porch with coffee and watched the light come off the water and felt, temporarily, that everything was the right size. She said so, out loud, without thinking about it. "It reminds you of where you were living," Julian said. Not a question exactly. South Carolina coast, similar geography. "Do you miss it?" She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she'd been thinking about things lately. "I miss the quiet," she said. "I don't miss the hiding." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there a version where you get the quiet without the hiding?" "I'm trying to find out," she said. Priya said something from the back seat about the exit they needed, and Julian adjusted the route, and the conversation moved on. But the question stayed with her for the rest of the drive in the way good questions do. Not demanding an answer, just sitting there, patient and present. The site itself was not picturesque. It was a former light manufacturing facility on 12 acres, the buildings half demolished, the ground still carrying the particular grayness of industrial land waiting to be something else. Julian walked her through the technical layout, where the modular units would be positioned, how the grid connection would work, what the phased build-out looked like. He explained it without dumbing it down, which she appreciated, and he let her ask questions without making her feel the questions were slowing him down, which she also appreciated. At one point they were standing at the eastern edge of the property, looking at the water about a quarter-mile off, and Julian said, "When this is running, it'll power about 40,000 homes, not a lot by Blackwood's scale. But the point isn't the first deployment. The point is the replication model," she said. "Right. If we get the first one right, and right means actually right, and not almost right, then the template works for every site that follows." He looked at the water. "I've spent 2 years being told the scale wasn't there yet. The scale was always there. The access wasn't. Access meaning capital. Access meaning someone willing to look at what it actually is instead of what it was going to cost." She looked at him. The wind was doing things to his hair, and he didn't seem to notice. "You're not great at patience," she said. He considered that. "I'm great at patience with the work. I'm bad at patience with people who have decided something without looking at it. That's a distinction I understand." They looked at the site for another minute in a silence that was comfortable in the specific way silences are comfortable when both people in them have stopped performing ease and are actually at ease. It was a quality she had noticed about Julian from early on, that he did not perform. He was bad at small talk, she had learned, in a way that could initially read as unfriendly and was actually just the absence of the particular social habit of filling space with noise. When he had something to say, he said it. When he didn't, he was quiet. She found it, in increments, a relief. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said. "I might not have an answer." "How do you know when something is worth the risk?" "The real risk, not the modeled one." He turned to look at her. She wasn't sure if he understood that she wasn't asking about the deployment site, or if he understood entirely. "You don't," he said. "That's not a useful answer, but it's the true one. You gather everything you can, and then at some point there's a gap between what you know and what you need to decide, and you have to step across it. The gap is always there. The question is whether what's on the other side is worth the step." She looked at the gray water. "And if you step and fall," she said. "Then you fell," he said. "And you know more than you did before." She looked at him. He was already looking at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. And the wind came off the water and the marsh grass moved, and somewhere behind them, Priya was discussing something technical with the infrastructure team, and the world continued its business around them. "The site looks right," she said finally. "It is right," he said. "Then let's build it." She said it about the deployment site. She was also, in the part of herself she was learning to listen to, saying something else. They drove back to New York that evening, and the conversation in the car was easier than the drive down had been, if that was possible. The backseat team fell asleep somewhere around Savannah, and Priya put in earbuds, and it was just Evelyn and Julian and the dark highway, and a conversation that moved through the deployment timeline, and then through the question of what the replication strategy looked like at 18 months, and then somehow through the territory of their respective families, which was new ground. She told him about her grandfather, about Harold Blackwood and the shipping company, and the particular fierce intelligence of a man who had built something from nothing and then handed it to people who understood the something but had forgotten the nothing. She told him about her father in the careful way she'd learned to talk about Charles Blackwood, acknowledging what he'd built and what he'd cost, because both things were true and she was done pretending one canceled the other. She told him about her mother, about the photograph, about hanging it that morning and standing there with the hammer and the strange arithmetic of outliving the versions of people you've loved. Julian listened in the way she'd come to understand was specific to him, not waiting for his turn to talk, actually listening, the way some people do who have spent a lot of time in rooms where the thing that mattered was the data in front of them and not the performance around it. He told her about his own family, a father who had worked construction in upstate New York, a mother who taught middle school science. Not money, not influence, not names that carried weight in rooms, just two people who had raised their son to believe that the thing you built with your hands was worth more than the thing you were handed, and who had been, by his account, largely right about that, and also occasionally exhausting. "She still asks me if I'm eating enough," he said. "I'm 38. My neighbor in Beaufort left tomatoes on my porch every August," Evelyn said, "for 7 years. That's the same thing. It's almost exactly the same thing." She looked out the window at the dark highway. "I left her a note when I left, just a few lines. I never called." "Why not?" "I didn't know how to explain where I'd gone, and I thought—" She paused, finding the honest version. "I thought if I called and heard her voice, it would make the leaving harder than I could afford it to be." Did it need to be affordable? She thought about that for a long time. Long enough that Julian didn't push it, just let the question breathe. "No," she said finally. "I don't think it did." She thought about Mrs. Patricia Gaines and her tomatoes and her too polite acceptance of terrible jam, and she made a note in her phone, a real note, something she would actually do, not a thing she was meaning to do, to write a real letter, not an explanation, just a letter. The kind people used to write to each other when they wanted to stay connected across distances, before distances became easier to bridge, and somehow, paradoxically, the bridging became something people did less of. The headquarters gala was not her idea. It was the board's idea, specifically Margaret Cho's, who argued with reasonable persuasiveness that Blackwood Global had spent a year demonstrating its operational recovery, and that a formal public event, not a press conference, not an investor day, but an actual gathering of the kind that signaled confidence rather than defensiveness, was warranted. The argument was strategic, and Evelyn knew it was correct and agreed to it in the way she agreed to things that were correct and that she would have preferred personally to avoid. The event was in February, in one of the large reception spaces in the building, and the guest list was the kind that produced its own gravity. Major investors, strategic partners, industry figures, a scatter of people from the civic and philanthropic world that Blackwood's humanitarian work touched. Julian would be there as the Meridian Partnership had been announced publicly in January to strong response, and his presence in the room carried its own significance in the sustainability infrastructure space. She did not think of it as a gala in the sense of performance. She thought of it as a moment of record, a line in the narrative that said, "This is where we are now, and this is the direction we are going." Companies needed those moments, the same way people did, not for vanity, for clarity. She wore black. Not a dramatic choice. She simply looked best in black, had always known it, and saw no reason to complicate that with symbolism. The dress was well cut and not fussy, and she wore her hair down because she was tired of the architectural arrangements that went with formal events and decided she was senior enough to abandon them. Gerald told her she looked formidable. "Good," she said. "That's what I was going for." "You always look formidable," he said. "Tonight, you also look like you're not entirely miserable, which is new." She told him to go find his seat. She stood at the edge of the room for a few minutes before things formally began, the way she always did at events like this. Not anxiously, just observing, getting a sense of the room before the room demanded something from her. The space was full of the particular energy of people who were there because the situation required it, and people who were there because they wanted to be. And the mix of those two energies was interesting to watch. She saw Franklin Holloway's name in the program, which surprised her until it didn't. He had accepted the invitation, which had been sent as a matter of protocol, given his firm's remaining legitimate business relationships with several of Blackwood's subsidiaries. The admission in the settlement had been significant and damaging, but it had not destroyed him, which she had known it wouldn't. Men like Franklin Holloway survived most things. What they did not survive was being exposed and documented, because the exposure followed them into rooms and changed the quality of every transaction they attempted afterward. And that was its own kind of consequence, sustained and compounding in a way that a single decisive blow would never have been. She saw him across the room. He was with two men she didn't recognize, and he was performing ease in the particular way of someone who has learned that performance of ease is the only available option when ease itself is no longer accessible. He did not look at her. She looked at him for exactly long enough to confirm that she felt nothing particular. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not the residual anger that had sharpened her through the early months of the return. Just the flat clarity of having done something she set out to do. He was a lesson, same as Nathan was a lesson. Same as most of the difficult things in her life had been lessons she hadn't asked for and wouldn't have chosen, and had been shaped by regardless. She looked away. Julian found her near the windows as the event moved into its second hour, past the formal remarks that Margaret had delivered with characteristic precision, and Evelyn herself had given with the particular efficiency of someone who knows what they need to say and trusts the room enough to say it directly. He had a glass of something and was holding it without drinking it, which she had noticed was a habit of his at events. He carried the drink the way some people carry a prop, something to do with the hand. "Good room," he said. "Good room," she agreed. "Your remarks were strong." "They were 7 minutes. Gerald timed them." "Gerald times your remarks?" "Gerald times everything. He kept track of my father's board presentations with a stopwatch for 20 years. It was an act of devotion that also happened to be extremely useful." Julian almost smiled. "How's the deployment going, since I'm being professional?" "You're terrible at professional." "I'm great at professional in the right context. This is a gala." "Deployment is on schedule," she said. "Robert's team did a site review last week. No material issues. Priya's installation timeline holds." "Good." He looked around the room. "I've been to a lot of these kinds of events trying to get people to listen to the Meridian pitch. This is the first one I've been at where I'm not trying to convince someone of something. How does that feel? Strange, he said. Mostly good. Some of the urgency goes out of the room when you're not fighting for something. You find a different thing to fight for, she said. He looked at her. Is that what happened with you? She considered the question with the honesty she'd been trying to apply to everything. I think I came back here to fight, she said. The board, Holloway, all of it. I needed something to push against, and I told myself that was strategy, and it was strategy, and it was also something else, something I needed to get out of my system. And now it's out? Mostly. She looked at the room. Now I'm trying to figure out what you build when you're not building it in opposition to something. Different kind of building, he said. Yes. Harder in some ways. Much harder, she said. Opposition gives you direction. The other kind, she paused. You have to find the direction yourself. He was quiet for a moment. The room moved around them, conversations and laughter and the low hum of an event proceeding the way events do, and the two of them stood in a pocket of stillness inside it that had become, she realized, a familiar thing. The stillness between them had started in the conference room with the whiteboard and the cold coffee, and it had been building in the car on the Georgia highway, and it was here now, in this room, and she was done pretending she hadn't noticed it or didn't know what it was. Julian, she said. Yes. I'm going to Beaufort in March. A few days. I have some unfinished things there. A letter to deliver in person. Some actual acknowledgement of a chapter closing. She looked at him. I thought you might want to come. He was quiet for a moment. As a professional colleague, he said carefully. No, she said. Another moment of quiet, and then, I'll clear my schedule. You don't have to clear it, she said. Just make the room. There's a difference? Clearing a schedule is about what you're willing to give up, she said. Making room is about what you're deciding matters. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of being moved by something. Not demonstrative, just a particular quality of attention. The eyes slightly different, the normal composure slightly less armored. I'll make the room, he said. She nodded once. They stood together at the window for a while longer, not performing conversation, just existing in the same space, which was its own kind of language, and one she was only lately remembering how to speak. The gala wound down around 10:30. Gerald found her near the end and told her it had been a success by every relevant metric, and she believed him because Gerald's metrics were reliable, and also because she had felt it herself. The quality of the room as something that had turned a corner, that was facing a direction it hadn't been facing before. Margaret Cho found her as the last guests were leaving and held her hand for a moment in both of hers, the way older women sometimes do when words aren't quite sufficient, and said, Your grandfather would have been proud. Evelyn thought about Harold Blackwood, the shipping company, the work, the man who had built something from nothing. She thought about this version of the company he'd imagined, and the version it had become, and the version she was trying to build it into now, which was different from both. I don't know about that, she said honestly, but I think he would have recognized the intention. Margaret squeezed her hand and let it go. March came in cold and then softened toward the middle of the month, the way early spring does in the southeast. Tentative at first, then sudden, like something that had been waiting for permission. Evelyn drove into Beaufort on a Thursday afternoon, alone. Julian would come Friday. She had wanted one day by herself first. She drove down Carteret Street and past the library and past the marina, and down the street where the yellow house still sat, occupied now by someone else. A family, it looked like. There were bikes on the porch and a child's drawing of something taped to the inside of a front window. She slowed but didn't stop. She sat at the stop sign at the end of the block for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the house. It was still a good house, small and well-made and salt-worn, with the porch that needed repainting every few years and the garden that took more patience than it gave back. She drove on. Mrs. Patricia Gaines was in her yard when Evelyn pulled up, as if she'd known, which she probably hadn't, but it felt right anyway. She was 78 and moved more carefully than before, with a slight hesitation in her left hip that Evelyn recognized from her own mother's later years, but she looked up from her garden border and went absolutely still for a moment. Then she said, Well, hello, Mrs. Gaines, Evelyn said. I got your note, Mrs. Gaines said. The one you left when you went. 3 lines. I know. I'm sorry about that. And I got your letter in November. I hoped it got there. Mrs. Gaines looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone deciding how much to say. You were good people, she said finally. Whatever happened, you were good neighbors and good people. I didn't need an explanation. She stopped. I worried about you. Evelyn felt that land somewhere real. I know, she said. I should have made it easier to stop. Come in, Mrs. Gaines said. I'll make tea. Don't argue. She did not argue. They sat in Mrs. Gaines' kitchen for 2 hours, which was longer than Evelyn had planned and exactly the right amount of time. Mrs. Gaines did not ask about the news stories, which had reached Beaufort the way news stories reach small coastal towns. Indirectly, through people who had read things online and mentioned them to other people, a slow diffusion that left the edges blurry. She asked how Evelyn was eating, which was, she had come to understand, the same question as how are you managing, just asked in a more useful form because it had a concrete answer. Evelyn told her she was eating better than she had been. Mrs. Gaines said the tomatoes had been excellent last summer and that she planned to grow more this year, and that she would send a box to an address if Evelyn left one. Evelyn left an address. She walked through town after, slowly, without a destination, the way she used to walk on mornings when she hadn't slept well and needed the air to settle her. Beaufort was the same, the Spanish moss, the painted porches, the water at the end of every street. She stopped at the library and went inside and spent 20 minutes looking at the shelves in the back corner where she had volunteered twice a week for 4 years, reshelving books in the particular satisfying order of alphabetical sequences, which was one of the most reliably peaceful activities she had ever found. She checked out a book. An old novel she'd meant to read for years and kept not getting to. She walked back to the hotel she was staying at, which was on the water, and sat on the small balcony and read until the light went, and then read in the lamplight for another hour, and did not check her phone, and did not think about the company or the board or the deployment schedule, and felt, for the first time in a long time, the particular uncomplicated quiet of being somewhere she had once loved without needing it to be anything other than what it was. Julian arrived Friday morning. He drove himself, which she should have expected. He was not a person who was driven to places if he could help it. He found the hotel, found her on the balcony with coffee and the novel, sat down in the other chair, and looked at the water for a moment. It's beautiful, he said. Yes. I can see why you stayed. 7 years, she said. That's not an accident. You don't stay somewhere 7 years by accident. She looked at him. No, she said. You don't. They spent 2 days in Beaufort without agenda, which was new for both of them and slightly awkward in the specific way of two people who are accustomed to purpose having to learn the shape of time without it. They walked along the waterfront and ate seafood at a place on the marina that had the best shrimp she'd had in years, and they argued about the novel she was reading. He'd read it, of course, and found to neither of their surprise that they disagreed about the ending, but for interesting reasons that made the disagreement feel like something other than a disagreement. He was bad at doing nothing, she discovered. Not in an anxious way, in the way of someone whose mind kept finding problems to work on, even when the problems weren't present. She watched him stare at the marsh from the hotel balcony Saturday morning and tracked the moment he started mentally engineering something, the particular quality of his focus changing, and she said, "Whatever you're designing, write it down so you can stop thinking about it." He looked at her. "How did you went somewhere," she said. "Your eyes did the thing." "My eyes do a thing?" "When you're working through a problem, yes." He looked slightly undone by this, in a way she found disproportionately endearing. He got out his phone and typed a note and put it away and looked at the marsh again, and this time he stayed. "Thank you," he said. "It's a useful skill," she said, "knowing when someone's gone somewhere and calling them back." He looked at her. "Is that what you needed?" "In Beaufort, someone to call you back when you'd gone somewhere." She thought about it honestly. "I needed to stop going so far," she said. "I think I used the quietness of this place to go a very long distance from myself, and I called it peace, and it was peace for a while. And then it was hiding, and I called it peace anyway because it felt similar from the inside." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you tell the difference?" "Peace doesn't require you to keep a secret," she said. That's the best distinction I've found. He considered that. I'm going to think about that for a long time. Good, she said. Think out loud when you figure something out. Sunday morning, she went to the cemetery at the edge of town, which was one of the old ones, with moss-covered headstones and enormous live oaks that had been there longer than the graves. She went alone. Julian had asked without asking, had been present and then deliberately absent at the right moment, which was the kind of emotional intelligence she had not expected and kept being surprised by. She stood at her mother's grave, which was here because this was where her mother had wanted to be. Not near the Blackwood family plot in Connecticut, not anywhere near the life that had consumed her, but in the place she had come on a vacation once with a college friend before she met Charles Blackwood, the place she had said was the only one that had ever felt like it belonged to her. Evelyn stood there for a while. She didn't speak out loud. She wasn't that kind of person, and her mother hadn't been either. She just stood in the January going-to-March air, with the Spanish moss moving gently in the live oak above the grave, and let herself feel the full shape of everything. The loss that didn't go away, and the love that didn't go away, and the complicated inheritance of being someone's child. All the ways they make you, and the ways you have to unmake and remake yourself to find out who you actually are underneath. She thought about the photograph on her wall at home. Her mother laughing, not yet hollowed out. She thought, I'm trying. She thought, I think you'd recognize what I'm trying to do. She looked at the sky through the live oak branches for a moment, the gray blue of early March, the quality of light that meant the season was about to change. Then she walked back to meet Julian for breakfast. That afternoon, driving back north on the coastal highway, Julian at the wheel and the afternoon light doing something extraordinary to the marsh, turning it gold and copper in a way that seemed almost implausible. Evelyn thought about the past year with the particular clarity that distance gives to things. Not the professional narrative, the board session, the Holloway settlement, the Meridian partnership, the stock price at an 18-month high. Those were true and they mattered, and she was not going to pretend they didn't. She thought about the other accounting, the harder one. She had come back to a company she'd walked away from, and she had taken it back from people who had been trying to dismantle it, and she had done that with competence and without apology, and she had been right to do it. That was one line of the accounting. She had made a life in a small house in a coastal town and loved a man who couldn't sustain it, and she had hidden herself in a way that made the failure more likely, and she had to own her part of that. That was another line. She had sat in the rubble of everything and decided to come back as herself, not as the person shaped by grief or anger or the need to prove something, but as the actual self that was still there underneath all of it. Imperfect, not entirely sure of itself, carrying old losses and new uncertainties, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has finally decided that surviving something is not the same as living through it. That was the line she was most uncertain about and most committed to. She had fallen, on the slow evidence of the past months, into something with Julian that she could not accurately describe as strategy or convenience or professional respect, though it had been all of those things at different points, and was still all of those things, and was also something that didn't have a clean category, which was, she had discovered, how the real things usually arrived. She did not know how it would go. That was true, and she was not pretending otherwise. She knew that he was honest with her in the ways that mattered. She knew that when she went somewhere, he called her back. She knew that he had cleared 2 days in his schedule, made the room, as she'd asked, without making her feel the weight of what it cost him, and that was not a small thing. The rest she would find out by living it. "What are you thinking?" Julian said. "A lot of things," she said. "Anything you want to share?" She looked at the marsh going gold in the afternoon light, the herons standing still in the shallows, the extraordinary, ordinary beauty of a place that had held her for 7 years and held her memory still. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I spent a long time believing the choice was between the big life and the quiet one, that I had to pick one and give up the other, the name or the peace, the company or myself. And I think that was a false choice. I think I made it a false choice because it was easier than figuring out how to want both without knowing if I could have them." He drove for a moment in silence. "Can you?" "I don't know yet," she said, "but I stopped believing the answer is definitely no, which is different from where I started." He nodded slowly. She had noticed that he nodded when he was actually absorbing something rather than responding to it, and she liked that about him, the way she liked most of the things she'd noticed about him, honestly and without the need to manage it. Different enough, he said. Different enough, she agreed. The highway curved north and the light shifted and the marsh gave way to pine forest, and then back to marsh again. The landscape cycling through its variations, the way landscapes do when you're moving through them rather than standing still in them. And Evelyn looked at it all, every mile of it, with the attention of someone who has learned the hard way and the long way and the only way most people actually learn things, that looking at where you are is not the same as being satisfied with it. And being unsatisfied with something is not the same as being unable to love it. She was not the woman who had left Beaufort in a black SUV 10 months ago, frightened and heartbroken and furious in equal measure, heading north to fight for something she'd walked away from and reclaim herself from a life she'd partly hidden inside. She was not the woman who had arrived in Beaufort 11 years ago either, 24 and exhausted and desperate for smallness. She was something that had been made by both of those women, and by the company, and by the yellow house, and by Nathan, who had broken her heart and taught her something about honest living even in the breaking, and by Gerald, who had waited and meant it, and by her mother laughing in a photograph, and by a man in the driver's seat who kept his hand steady on the wheel and called her back when she went somewhere. She was not finished. She was finally pointed in her own direction. Outside the window, the sun was going down over the Carolina Low Country, going orange and then red, and then the particular deep color that comes just before dark. And the marsh grass moved in the last of the day's wind, and Mrs. Gaines's tomatoes were already beginning their slow work underground, and somewhere in the files of the SEC, a formal admission sat in a regulatory record where it would stay as long as records stayed. And somewhere in a conference room in Manhattan, a deployment plan was moving forward that would eventually power 40,000 homes, and then more than that. And somewhere in Connecticut, a man named Nathan Reed was seeing a therapist on Tuesdays and trying to become something more honest than what he'd been. None of it was clean. All of it was real. And Evelyn Blackwood, who had once been Evelyn Carter, who had been a hidden heiress and a terrible gardener and a maker of genuinely bad jam, who had sat at a candlelit table and received divorce papers on her anniversary and not cried until the bathroom door was closed, who had made one phone call and changed everything, who had walked into a boardroom and held her ground, and then walked into a cemetery in March and stood quietly at her mother's grave. Evelyn looked at the fading southern sky and felt, without performing it and without needing to explain it to anyone, something that was as close to free as she had ever been. Not free from everything, free toward something. That was better. That was, she thought, enough to build on.